response to that video last night from the family?
Right. I think they're playing this out. This is about all they have right now, and they're making it very clear that they will pay. The question really is, and I'm very skeptical of this, is this really a kidnapping? Does somebody really have her, and is she really alive? And I don't think we have the answers to that question right now. I don't think her proof of life has been credibly authenticated at this point. So I think, you see them searching other places. You see them searching in the backyard there at that so-called manhole. They're still rounding out the investigation, and so I think they're giving some leeway for some possibility that this is not a kidnapping. And as I said, I'm very skeptical that it is one in the first place.
The desert air in the Catalina foothills is usually silent, a heavy, dry stillness that blankets the luxury estates of Tucson. But on the morning of February 1st, that silence was shattered. It began with a disconnected signal, a digital heartbeat that suddenly went flat. Nancy Guthrie, an 84-year-old grandmother whose life was measured in the steady pings of a high-tech pacemaker, had effectively vanished from the grid. At 2:28 a.m., her pacemaker app lost its connection to her phone. It wasn't a glitch. It was the first clue in a mystery that would soon captivate the nation and baffle the world's most elite investigators. When police arrived at the sprawling, secluded property, they didn't find a forced entry or a ransacked home. Instead, they found the eerie remnants of a life interrupted. Nancy's purse was still there. Her phone, the very device that should have been transmitting her vitals, sat untouched. But on the porch, under the harsh glow of the desert moon, investigators found something that chilled them to the bone: traces of Nancy's DNA and droplets of blood. The initial narrative was terrifyingly simple. A fragile elderly woman had been snatched from the one place she should have been safe, her own home. By 1:47 a.m., a doorbell camera had captured a grainy, haunting image. A masked figure, gloved and carrying a black Ozark Trail backpack, lurking in the shadows. Moments later, the camera was blinded, the feed cut to black. For 22 days, the world believed this was a high-stakes kidnapping. The FBI deployed 400 personnel. The President of the United States issued a statement of support.
Promised Savannah Guthrie's family the full support of federal law enforcement. FBI is now...
I'll give you a little statement. I think we're doing very well on that regard. You're probably surprised to hear that. I think we're doing very well. Very well, meaning we have some clues, I think, that are very strong. And I think we could have some answers coming up fairly soon.
Is this a nationwide search? Is this a search going to Mexico?
I'm not talking about a search. I'm talking about a solution. We have some things I think that will maybe come out reasonably soon from DOJ or FBI or whoever that could be
Suspect?
Yeah, could be definitive.
So when do you expect us to hear?
A lot's taken place in the last couple of hours. A lot of things have happened with regard to that horrible situation in the last couple of hours.
Ransom demands for $6 million in Bitcoin began flooding media outlets like TMZ, painting a picture of a sophisticated criminal underground holding a grandmother for leverage. But as the days turned into weeks, the polished veneer of the kidnapping story began to crack. No proof of life, no photos, no voice recordings, just a deafening silence from the captors and a growing suspicion among seasoned investigators that the masked man on the porch wasn't a kidnapper at all, but a performer in a very dark play. Experts are now breaking their silence, and the theory they're proposing is more disturbing than any abduction. They claim Nancy Guthrie was never kidnapped. They claim the evidence left behind wasn't a trail to follow, but a map designed to lead us into the wilderness. Tonight, we peel back the layers of smoke and mirrors to reveal the chilling reality of what happened inside that home. If you're gripped by this mystery and want to see how the evidence unravels, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to True Crime Threads. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the cases that defy explanation. What do you think? Was the masked man a kidnapper or a decoy? Let us know in the comments below. To understand the weight of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, one must look at the woman behind the headlines. At 84, Nancy was the matriarch of a family that lived under the constant glare of the spotlight. She was the mother of Savannah Guthrie, a face known to millions. But in the quiet corridors of her Tucson home, Nancy was defined by her grace and her mounting physical vulnerabilities. Nancy wasn't just elderly, she was medically fragile. Her life was governed by a strict regimen of heart medications and the constant monitoring of a pacemaker. According to local authorities and her own family, Nancy struggled to walk even 50 yards without assistance. She was a woman who found sanctuary in the security of her home, a residence set far back from the road, protected by a perimeter that should have been impenetrable to a random predator. Her life in the Catalina foothills was supposed to be a peaceful sunset, a reward for years of supporting her family's meteoric rise. She was close with her daughter, Annie, and her son-in-law, Tommaso Ciani. On the night of January 31, 2026, life seemed perfectly routine. Nancy had just returned home from a pleasant dinner with Annie and Tommaso. At 9:50 p.m., her garage door hissed shut, sealing her inside what everyone believed was a fortress of safety. But within the walls of that fortress, there were tensions that the public rarely saw. While the family presented a united front of hope and desperation, investigators began to look closer at the threat vectors surrounding a high-profile family. In the world of elite security, Nancy was considered a low-risk victim in a low-risk environment. For an intruder to breach that environment, the motivation had to be extraordinary. Jim Clement, a retired FBI profiler, notes that when a high-risk crime is committed against a low-risk victim, the motive is rarely simple. It's often personal, ideological, or driven by a dark, internal logic. Was Nancy Guthrie a target of opportunity, or was she a pawn in a much larger, more intimate game? As the investigation deepened, the portrait of a simple kidnapping began to blur. Neighbors spoke of the family's privacy, but also of the constant stream of caregivers and staff that moved through the home. Each one was a potential link to the outside world, a way for information about Nancy's wealth and her physical frailty to leak out. Yet, as the FBI began background checks on everyone with a key, they found no gangbangers, no obvious criminals, only a growing list of questions about who truly benefited from Nancy vanishing into the desert night. The dream of a safe, quiet retirement had turned into a cinematic nightmare. The woman who couldn't walk to her own mailbox had supposedly been spirited away by a professional team, leaving behind only a few drops of blood and a digital trail that ended in a sudden, violent silence. To the public, she was a victim. To the experts, she was becoming a ghost in a staged haunting. As the sun rose over the Tucson desert in the days following the disappearance, the investigation began to yield anomalies that didn't fit the profile of a professional abduction. In a real kidnapping, the victim is a commodity. The captors want to trade that commodity for cash as quickly as possible, minimizing their own risk of capture. But in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the kidnappers seemed more interested in the spotlight than the ransom. The first red flag was the ransom notes themselves. Typically, kidnappers establish a private, secure line of communication with the family to avoid federal interception. Instead, these demands, written with a strange, performative flair, were sent directly to news outlets and celebrity gossip sites. They demanded $6 million in Bitcoin, yet the digital wallets provided were empty, showing zero transaction history. It wasn't a negotiation, it was a broadcast. Former FBI agent Jennifer Coffindaffer observed a chilling pattern. The timing and delivery of these notes felt less like a financial transaction and more like a form of psychological torture. They were designed to keep the story in the headlines, feeding the media cycle rather than securing a payout. When the family, led by Savannah Guthrie's public pleas, offered to pay any price for her mother's return, the response from the captors was not a set of instructions, but more cryptic messages sent to the press. Then there was the matter of the doorbell footage. The masked figure appeared at 1:47 a.m., perfectly framed for the camera before disabling it. Experienced investigators like Paul Cialino pointed out the suspicious convenience of this. If a professional crew was targeting a high-profile home, they would likely disable the security system before approaching or avoid the cameras entirely. Here, the intruder seemed to want to be seen, just enough to establish the kidnapper narrative, but not enough to be identified. Perhaps the most haunting red flag was Nancy's physical condition. The sheriff's department confirmed that Nancy was entirely dependent on daily heart medication. Without it, the consequences would be fatal within days. If she had been kidnapped, her captors would have needed to be medical experts to keep her stable, yet there was no evidence of them attempting to obtain her prescriptions or seeking medical help. As the 22-day mark passed, the silence from the kidnappers regarding Nancy's health became a grim indicator. In the history of high-profile abductions, a lack of proof of life for this long almost always points to a singular, tragic conclusion. The person is no longer alive to provide it. The experts began to whisper a word that changed everything: staging. Was the blood on the porch and the masked man in the backpack a carefully constructed set piece? Was the investigation being led on a wild goose chase into the desert, while the truth remained buried much closer to home? The crime itself was not a symphony of sirens and shattering glass. It was a quiet, clinical erasure. On the night of January 31st, Nancy Guthrie was a woman cocooned in the perceived safety of her Catalina foothills estate. But as the clock ticked toward the early hours of February 1st, the timeline of her life began to unravel in a series of digital and physical anomalies that suggest a terrifying precision. At 1:47 a.m., the doorbell camera flickered to life. The footage is brief, haunting, and looks more like a frame from a horror film than a suburban security feed. A figure emerges from the desert shadows, clad in dark clothing with a mask obscuring their face. They carry a black Ozark Trail backpack, a common, nondescript item that offers no clues to their identity. The figure doesn't fumble. They move with a chilling deliberateness toward the lens. Within seconds, the feed is blinded. The eye of the house is gouged out, leaving the rest of the night to unfold in total darkness. What happened in the next 41 minutes is the black hole of this entire case. There were no reports of a struggle, no screams echoing across the valley, and no neighbors reported the sound of a vehicle speeding away. Yet, at precisely 2:28 a.m., the digital tether was severed. Nancy's pacemaker, a device designed to keep her alive, stopped communicating with her phone. In a traditional kidnapping, the goal is to keep the victim mobile and alive. But the sheriff's department made a grim admission: Nancy Guthrie could not walk 50 yards on her own. To remove her from that house, an intruder would have had to carry her, a frail, 84-year-old woman, across a rugged desert landscape or into a waiting vehicle, all while avoiding the gaze of a neighborhood teeming with high-end surveillance. When investigators finally stepped onto the porch, the scene they found was a paradox. It was too clean for a struggle, yet too loud to be an accident. The drops of blood and the traces of DNA were left in plain sight, almost as if they were breadcrumbs. Inside the house, the silence was even more heavy. Her purse, her keys, and her life-saving medications were all left behind. To take Nancy without her medicine was, in the eyes of medical experts, a death sentence from the moment she crossed the threshold. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a subtraction. A human being was removed from a high-security environment with the efficiency of a ghost, but ghosts don't leave DNA, and they don't appear on doorbell cameras. The sheer perfection of the crime, the way it hit every beat of a cinematic abduction while ignoring the messy reality of handling an elderly, infirm victim, is exactly what led elite investigators to a staggering conclusion. The crime they were looking at wasn't a kidnapping. It was a masterpiece of misdirection. The days following the disappearance saw the launch of one of the most intensive federal manhunts in Arizona history. Yet the further the FBI pushed into the desert, the more the ground seemed to vanish beneath them. As 400 agents combed the rugged terrain and air units circled the Catalina foothills, the physical evidence began to tell a story that contradicted the frantic headlines. The primary focus of the cover-up was a sophisticated trail of digital breadcrumbs. The ransom notes, demanding millions in Bitcoin, were analyzed by the FBI's cybercrime units. They discovered a jarring inconsistency. While the notes claimed to be from a ruthless criminal organization, the technical execution was hollow. The Bitcoin addresses provided remained stagnant, with no test, transactions, or attempts to verify the family's ability to pay. It was a digital ghost, a facade of a kidnapping designed to consume the investigators' time and resources, while the trail back at the house grew cold. Then came the forensic revelations that stalled the case. Investigators recovered a pair of black gloves 2 miles from the Guthrie estate. DNA testing revealed the profile of an unknown male, but when run through CODIS, the national database of 19 million offenders, there was no match. Inside the home, another set of unknown DNA was found on a surface Nancy rarely touched. Again, no match. In the world of stranger abductions, it is statistically rare for 2 separate, unknown individuals with no criminal record to coordinate such a high-risk hit. It suggested something far more calculated, the use of clean actors, or a staging so meticulous that it utilized DNA as a red herring. The most damning piece of the cover-up, however, was the dead air of the surveillance. While the front door captured the masked man, the rest of the estate's security was a void. Google's forensic experts were brought in to recover layers of deleted data from the home's smart system, but they hit a wall. The data hadn't just been deleted, it had been professionally scrubbed. By day 22, the kidnapping began to look like a performance. Paul Cialino, the veteran homicide investigator, noted that real kidnappers are motivated by greed and fear. They want the money fast because every hour they hold a victim, the risk of the death penalty increases. Here, there was no urgency. There was only a narrative being fed to the media, a story of a masked intruder and a border crossing that Sheriff Nanos later admitted had zero evidence to support it. As the search and rescue mission was officially downgraded to a crime scene investigation, the grim reality set in. The FBI wasn't chasing a kidnapper. They were chasing a script. In the traditional arc of a high-profile crime, this is the moment where the handcuffs click, the cameras flash in a crowded courthouse, and a judge reads a lengthy sentence that brings a sense of finality. But in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the courtroom has remained the court of public opinion, and the sentencing has been a grueling, indefinite period of unanswered questions. As of early 2026, no one has been charged with the kidnapping or murder of Nancy Guthrie. The legal aftermath has been defined not by a trial, but by a chilling stalemate between the official narrative and the forensic reality. While Sheriff Nanos and the FBI initially categorized the event as a targeted abduction, the lack of a proof of life, after 22 days, shifted the internal focus of the investigation. The legal system cannot prosecute a kidnapping without a kidnapper, and it cannot prosecute a murder without a body or a definitive crime scene. Despite the $200,000 reward and the direct involvement of the Department of Justice, the digital trail remained a dead end. The sophisticated Bitcoin demands that once dominated the news cycle were legally scrutinized and found to be untraceable, likely routed through encrypted servers designed to mask the origin of the sender. This technological wall meant that prosecutors couldn't even issue a subpoena to a suspect, because, on paper, the suspect didn't exist. The sheriff's department faced immense pressure to name a person of interest. Rumors swirled around the family, the caregivers, and even the son-in-law, Tommaso Ciani. However, the legal reality was different. The family remained fully cooperative, and the sheriff took the unusual step of publicly clearing them, stating they were victims of a cruel, calculated hit. Yet the paint-peeling process of genetic genealogy continues behind closed doors. This is the new frontier of the law, where investigators take the unknown DNA found on the black gloves and the interior of the home and trace it through family trees. It is a slow, methodical march toward a name. When that name finally surfaces, the legal battle won't just be about Nancy's disappearance. It will be a landmark case on the nature of staging, and the lengths a perpetrator will go to create a digital smokescreen. For now, the scales of justice remain perfectly balanced, tipped only by the heavy weight of a missing woman who left behind everything but a reason why. While the investigators whispered about staging and the media dissected the digital trails, a family was left to navigate a grief that had no form. To the world, Nancy Guthrie was a headline. To her daughters and grandchildren, she was the steady pulse of their lives, now replaced by a haunting, static-filled silence. The emotional toll of a disappearance without a body is a unique kind of purgatory, a disenfranchised grief, where there is no funeral to attend, no grave to visit, and no finality to the pain. Savannah Guthrie's public pleas became the emotional anchor of the case. Her voice, usually composed and authoritative as she delivered the news to millions, broke under the weight of a daughter's desperation. On February 4th, she stood before the cameras not as a journalist but as a victim, begging for a single sign, a photo, a recording, anything that proved her mother was still breathing. That plea was met with 18 days of silence, a cruelty that experts like Jennifer Coffindaffer identified as deliberate psychological warfare. In the community of the Catalina foothills, the atmosphere shifted from neighborly peace to a cold, pervasive paranoia. Residents who once left their doors unlocked now lived behind fortified gates, looking at their own staff and service workers with newfound suspicion. The threat vector the FBI spoke of had breached the sense of security for an entire city. Inside the Guthrie home, the tragedy was measured in the small, agonizing details. The untouched heart medication on the nightstand, the favorite chair that remained empty. The family's offer of millions in Bitcoin was a testament to their desperation, a willingness to bankrupt themselves for a woman they knew was likely already beyond their reach. But as the sheriff began to shut down the search and rescue mission, transitioning the effort into a cold room investigation, the family had to face a devastating reality. The world was moving on to the next mystery, while they remained trapped in the early hours of February 1st. The community reaction turned from sympathy to a darker curiosity, fueled by online rumors that the sheriff desperately tried to quell. For the Guthries, the cost of this crime wasn't just the loss of a matriarch. It was the public dismantling of their privacy and the agonizing realization that the person who took Nancy didn't just want her gone. They wanted to ensure her family never found peace. As the dust settles over the high Sonoran Desert, the case of Nancy Guthrie remains a haunting anomaly in the annals of American crime. We are left with a series of jagged pieces that refuse to form a coherent picture. On one hand, a frail woman who could barely walk, vanishing in the dead of night. On the other, a digital phantom demanding millions in a currency they never intended to collect. The silence that followed wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a void where the truth should have been. If Nancy was kidnapped, where is the proof of life? If she was the victim of a random home invasion, why was the crime scene so meticulously sanitized of common mistakes? And if the experts are right, if this was a staged performance, then the masked man with the Ozark Trail backpack wasn't a predator, but a character in a script written to deceive the world's most powerful investigators. Paul Cialino, Jim Clement, and Jennifer Coffindaffer all point to the same chilling conclusion. Real life is messy, but this crime was too clean. It possessed the narrative beats of a Hollywood thriller, yet it lacked the desperate human errors that define real abductions. We are left to wonder if the search for Nancy Guthrie was ever a search for a person, or merely a chase after a shadow designed to lead us away from a much darker reality hidden within the walls of that Catalina foothills estate. Nancy Guthrie deserved a sunset filled with the warmth of her family and the peace of her home. Instead, her legacy is a digital heartbeat that stopped at 2:28 a.m., and a mystery that challenges our understanding of justice and modern forensic science. The DNA on those black gloves and the scrubbed data in the Google Cloud still hold the potential for a name, a motive, and a final resting place. But until that day comes, Nancy remains a ghost in the machine, a reminder that in the age of total surveillance, the most terrifying things can still happen in the dark. The desert eventually gives up its secrets, but it does so in its own time, grain by grain. Until then, we are left staring at the grainy footage of a masked stranger, wondering if we are looking at a monster or a mask worn by someone we've known all along. This case is far from over, and the truth is often stranger than the fiction we are fed. What do you believe happened in those missing 41 minutes? Was the kidnapping a sophisticated hit or a desperate cover-up? Share your theories in the comments below. Your insight might be the piece of the puzzle we're missing. If you found this deep dive chilling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Threads. Tap that notification bell so you're the first to know when new evidence surfaces. Thank you for watching, and remember, some threads are better left unpulled.